I was not expecting great things about the Greatsword of Solitude, and I think you guys will be pretty surprised too. After maximizing this weapon's potential, this weapon has solid offerings to the table. In the recent weapon poll, you guys also requested this weapon, so here we are. I'm the Samurai and I'll be guiding you on how to maximize the usage of the Greatsword of Solitude, state the possible challenges that this weapon has, and help you overcome them. So ultimately help you decide if you want to go for this build. The Iron Berserker entered the lands between with its iron will and unimaginable strength, carrying a huge sword that can cut enemies in half with sheer force. A true berserker that can deal with hard-hitting sword swings and overpowers its enemies with immense stance damage. And fights usually end fast because of this build's firepower. Being able to perform in close to mid-range combat is the specialty of the Iron Berserker, and players who would love a focused and yet strong build to play, this is the build that they are looking for. This build focuses on strength to ensure that each attack hits like an absolute freight train, and also bear with my audio for this one since we are experiencing heavy thunderstorms currently, so you may hear it in the background. The build playstyle is out of the way, moving on to the Iron Berserker's stats. Note that I will be standardizing all of my builds around level 200, and it's up to you if you wish to level up past around this level. Starting with Vigor first, and I allocated 50 points to Vigor since it is likely that the user will be getting hit while performing the weapon's unique skill animation, as it is a multi-hitting skill. You can however adjust it to 60 points if you think you really need more health while adjusting to the build's gameplay. Next is Mind, and 24 points were allocated to it. 24 points is more than enough for us to perform optimally in this build, as we are going to be focusing on the weapon's skill alone. Endurance is next, and I have allotted 40 points for Endurance. So far, this build is by far the most stamina hungry build that I played so far, so having 40 points is a must. Strength and Dexterity are going to be our main offensive stats in this build, and allocating 80 to Strength and 39 to Dexterity is suggested. As for Intelligence, I suggest allocating at least 11 points for us to be able to wield our secondary weapon later on, while 25 points were allocated to Fate for us to access our key buffs later on. Lastly, we do not need Arcane for this build, so no points were allocated for it. Stats are out of the way, let's move on to the Iron Berserker's equipment. Starting with the build's main weapon, which is the mentioned Greatsword of Solitude. This Greatsword requires 27 strength and 13 dexterity for a user to wield the weapon properly, while having A scaling for strength and D scaling for dexterity. Moving on to the Greatsword of Solitude's unique skill, which is the Solitary Moonslash. This skill simply surprised me right out of the gate with its high damage multiplier and great stance damage. Pressing L2 plus R2 will let the user perform a concentrated vacuum slice that has a decent range. Pressing R2 again will render the user to do a violent 360-degree sword swing that not only hits like an absolute freight train but also deals tons of stance damage to targets. Small to mid-sized targets will always flinch when getting hit by the vacuum slice, while most of the time getting knocked back when getting hit by the 360 finisher. Targets are usually getting down or staggered when the user masters this monster skill, and will be getting more openings than usual to deal further damage. Moving on to the build's secondary weapon, and I am using the Finger Seal to be able to cast our key buffs later on. We'll be focusing on the Greatsword Solitude alone in this build to deal the majority of the damage. Since the vacuum slice of the Solitary Moonslash has somewhat limited range, I decided to equip a Keen Smith Script dagger slotted with Piercing Throw Ashes of War. This weapon is only for variety purposes and for us to deal ideal range attacks. Although the damage of this Ashes of War is not that high, it is pretty helpful when dealing with unreachable targets or when the boss is in the middle of an AoE attack to keep the DPS running. If you want more of a cone-like AoE attack when dealing with multiple targets, I suggest slotting in Scattershot Throw instead. You will only lose the desirable range of the Piercing Throw, but it's not going to be the end of the world. Weapons are out of the way, let's move on to spells. The first on the list is the Flame Grant Me Strength as usual for an additional 20% additional attack boost and stamina recovery buff. The second buff on the list is of course Golden Vow. This buff increases overall damage by 15% and adds 10% damage negation, which is very helpful for this build. Since this build focuses only on strength stat, you do have an option to drop Smith Script Dagger to allocate all of the surplus points to Fate just in case you want to slot in incantations that you prefer. But before anything else, only 6% of you who watch the channel regularly are subscribed, So help the channel by subscribing today, and it's free anyway, and I will thank you forever. If you can hit that like button as well, it will surely help me a lot. Spells are out of the way, moving on to my suggested talismans for this build. The first talisman on the list is our staple Shard of Alexander. This provides a 15% skill damage increase, especially when performing our solitary Moonslash. You are going to be fighting bosses head-on, so a Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman is suggested. The additional 20% physical damage negation it provides increases your overall survivability, especially when you are not used to the build's playstyle. The next talisman for this build is the mandatory two-headed turtle talisman. Even with 40 endurance, you will be depleting your stamina fast like any other, especially if you are cranking out damage. So slotting in the two-headed turtle talisman is perfect for this build for its additional stamina regeneration bonus. Next is slotting in the two-handed sword talisman, as you will be two-handing the Greatsword of Solitude a lot. This talisman will make your already high damage even better, and each wing will pack a punch. Moving on to Great Runes, and Godric's Great Rune is suggested rune for this build for additional 5 stats across the board. However, I can see that Malenia's Great Rune will work great in this build, as you can easily regain some of the health that you've lost just in case you get hit while in the middle of the solitary Moonslash animation. Now that the main equipment is out of the way, let's move on to the Iron Berserker's armor set. I'm going for this strong grayish Iron Knight theme, so I equipped the Solitude Helm for the headpiece, Blight's armor piece, gauntlets, and greaves. With this combination, I nailed the looks that I was going for. If you don't care about the looks and you want to optimize your damage further, wear the full Rakshasa set for the additional 8% all damage bonus. Moving on to my Flash of Wondrous Physique combination, Stormbarb Cracktier is a no-brainer for this build, as you can even increase the already strong stance damage of this build further. And since this build is stamina hungry, pairing it with Green Burst Crystal Tier is suggested. For those of you who will stay until the end, I do have a bonus tip for you, so stay tuned for that. Equipment and spells are out of the way, it's time for the build's pros and cons. Starting with pros first, and the first advantage that I can think of is the build's insanely high damage. As mentioned, this weapon surprised me a lot, and I was pretty much surprised how the solitary Moonslash could deal with huge numbers in a short period. Even by just using the vacuum slice alone without using the finisher, you can easily see its high damage output. I often use the vacuum slice without the finisher when dealing with fast moving targets. It's just too good to be able for a user to spam it easily. Since you made it this far, I do have a bonus quick tip for you. Drop Smith's Crypt Dagger and Pump Fate stat to 38. Instead of Stormbarb Cracktier, slot in the Blood-Sucking Cracktier for more damage. Next is slot in the Blessing of the Erdtree incantation to somehow slow down the HP loss per second. You will deal an insane amount of damage overall, but only do this if you already mastered the build's playstyle, since it may lead to more deaths. I'm aware that this weapon is a good stance damage weapon, and most of your targets will be bouncing like flies most of the time. As mentioned, targets are usually down or staggered, meaning you will always be dealing additional damage and take advantage of their sorry state. In my experience, I often break enemy stance by pulling out 2 consecutive solitary Moonslash when facing bosses. So the next pro that I can think of is, since we are mastering the solitary Moonslash in this build, a player who likes focus and simple gameplay will love this build. Mastering the skills ups and downs, when to use it, when to do the full combo, all that jazz, while juggling hard-hitting heavy greatsword attacks. Moving on to the cons, on the other hand, the solitary Moonslash is definitely a strong skill, however, the whole skill animation has this long wind-up time, so getting hit while in the middle of it may be frequent, especially when adjusting to its overall wind-up time. Being able to unload the whole animation on fast-moving targets, especially DLC bosses, can be a challenging task for many users out there, and this is the reason why I suggested to just perform the vacuum slice and you will be safe most of the time. As mentioned, I cannot stress how stamina hungry this build is, especially if you're trying to crank out damage per opening. In contrast to the build's positive focus gameplay, some users may find the build's over or playstyle mundane in the long run because of the lack of variety it offers. It all boils down to the personal preference at the end of the day. Overall, the Iron Berserker really surprised me to the fullest, as I was expecting mid-tier damage overall. Players who love to capitalize on slow-moving and yet superbly strong build will love the Iron Berserker's playstyle. Punishing enemies with its insane raw firepower and stance damage can be a solid gameplay for many. Comment down below which weapon would you like me to do next. And if you made it this far, I just want to say that I do appreciate you. Join our Discord server as we are building an empire where you can find like-minded players, and we also post our latest updates over there. As always, giving this video a like helps me a lot, and make sure to subscribe as more builds coming soon. Now if you want to shred enemies like butter or learn how to build the strongest build currently, these build videos are for you. And I will catch you on the next one.